So I listened to an hour of this so-called debate or discussion or conversation or whatever you want to call it between Sargon and Andrew Anglin, the creator of the Daily Stormer. And honestly, just don't invite Sargon to debate anymore, okay? I mean, he just can't do it. I don't know why, but Andrew Anglin is not even a smart all-writer. If I have Sargon's confidence, I could do it quite easily. I don't know why Sargon keeps avoiding this dude's questions and arguments and why he can't even perceive himself doing it. I don't know. But since people want to hear a debate, Sargon, I'm doing you a favor to take so much time out of my busy dissertation period to do it for you. This is how you could have answered and debated this guy. You're welcome.
I guess my question to start with for Sargon would be, do you grant the moral premise that white people have a right to their own country, and you're just saying that it's impossible to make that happen?
White people have just as much right as everybody else to their own country. And no, it's not impossible to make it happen. It just depends on how it's done. I may have objections, which I will go into later, but this is just taking a very vague and extreme position. But I don't think, just going by these words, anybody would disagree that white people have a right to a country. Now, when you say, quote, their own country, then there are several problems with definitions, starting with the obvious: where do you draw the line at white people in terms of ancestry and or looks? Let me make it easier for you. I would define as this: people who have similar ancestry in terms of culture and longevity have a right to congregate together and continue to live in the lands from which they have evolved in, and have a right to preserve their ethnic cultural identities and history.
My country, I'm not there right now, but the United States, as it was formed, okay, which was as a white nationalist country. Our entire history, the writings of Thomas Jefferson and the other founding fathers, this was a white nationalist country. We had laws enforcing white nationalism in the United States of America. That's what I believe in.
I don't believe this is true. I think this is exaggerated in terms of the American principle, even from the beginning when the United States was established. But even if it's true, as soon as they started importing non-whites from other countries forcefully as slaves and slave laborers, and I'm not even just talking about black people, they also forcibly imported Chinese people, aka the coolies, to work on the railroads. As soon as they decided to do that, it stopped being a solely quote-unquote white nationalist country. So blame yourself for not keeping your country quote-unquote white. And no, you cannot now try to rectify the situation by deporting these people, who many of them have ancestry even longer than many white immigrants, because that would be a huge violation of human rights. Now, to make it more clear, I'm now specifically talking about citizens. And as I have already defined who have rights to a country the last time, these specific people have just as much rights to a country as their white counterpart. Otherwise, if you want to implement some kind of deportation policies, then whites who have ancestry that is just as long as these blacks or shorter would also need to be deported. I'm fine with this, by the way. But if you don't do that, you are violating human rights. Once again, please don't strawman me. As of this moment, I'm only talking about American citizens. Immigrants and foreigners are a whole other issue, which I will go into later.
We need to get to the heart of the disagreement, and the heart of the disagreement is whether or not white people deserve their own countries.
As individual citizens deserving living in a country of citizenship, yes. Skin color doesn't matter here.
The values your country was founded on are contradictory to the values you're trying to espouse.
That's not true, Sargon. It existed.
Absolutely
What we are talking about is something that
true, which is why
all your John Locke stuff. This happened in a white nationalist country.
Again, semantics. If you have an immigration policy based on race and not individual contributions to your society, then most definitely it runs into conflict with the liberalist principles. And by the way, this is exactly what is happening in Europe right now. Sweden, for example, is only allowing in certain groups of economic migrants. They're not opening up their borders to every country, so they're essentially ethnically, racially profiling. Some people have a very easy time to get into Sweden, other people would have next to no chance. And I've talked about this before. I happen to know how difficult it is in comparison to the US to immigrate to any European country the meritocratic legal way. I know, as I've said before, I'm kind of a Europhile, and I really wanted to at least live in Europe for a few years, but I've talked to many Chinese people who try to look for jobs there, even getting very advanced degrees there, and then look for jobs there. And they've all told me that staying in Europe is pretty much impossible. Why? Because they would tend to hire their own citizens for the job. Now, let me be clear, this is not unique to Europe. The Americans are actually the unique ones here. It's the same with any nationalist country with a long, continuous cultural history and civilization, so I'm not complaining here. My point is that if they are going to do this, they should apply this to any and every foreigner, but they're not doing that. So they are going directly against liberal values of individualism and equality. Any state that has an immigration policy based on profiling people based on race and ethnicity is not a good policy. And yes, if let's say China does this, let's say they say, oh, if you are of Chinese descent, even if let's say you are an American second generation citizen, you're welcome to come in and get a job, even applying for citizenship. But if you're white or black, you just can't. I would be against such policy also.
Every country was not racially nationalist historically.
Nope, every country was culturally and historically nationalist throughout human history. There were many different racial groups in any country with a large enough population and especially had a history of conquest. China, for example, has 56 different ethnic groups. Britain also has at least 3, the Celts, the Anglo-Saxons who are of a Germanic group, and some Latins because it was part of the Roman Empire. People mix now, but historically they were of different racial groups, and depending on how far back you go, Celts can recognize a Latin or an Anglo, and vice versa. Now, you may argue, but they don't look as different as white versus blacks or Asians. And that's true because historically, people didn't have the technology to venture and conquer lands so far away from where they live. And the further away the land, the more different people will look. That's just evolution. But hey, if you wanted a national state that comprised of just Europeans, and I'm guessing you won't count the Turks, so let's say that's where you draw your line in terms of ancestry, you should blame your European ancestors for inventing technologies to do what no one else was able to do during the same time. But since they've opened up this door and they have conquered lands so different from them, and they have forcefully taken people so different from them to their established lands, that's why you can't just stay 100% white anymore. Because historically, this is true as well. For example, the reason why Chinese nationalist identity was established to include not just the Han people, but 55 other national ethnic groups is for the exact same reason. Even though during the time when the Chinese national identity was established, different ethnic groups were quite segregated, very similar to the white and black segregation in America throughout history. Another even more salient example would be Turkey, which resides precisely on the edge of the West or European versus the Asian. They consider Middle Eastern countries to be Asian then. The Ottomans historically have conquered lands from 3 continents. They were able to do that partially due to their geography being the middle of the 2 worlds. As a result, Turkey is comprised of many ethnic groups. They have greatly mixed now because they didn't care so much about how people looked, but mostly their religion and their culture. The Ottoman ruling class have much bloodlines from Europe, from Slavs to Greeks to Italians, but Turkey is a nationalist state, and they didn't go around weeding out all the non-Turks or non-Ottomans. And yes, Turks and Ottomans do look very different from Slavs or Italians or Greeks, but they mix with those people nonetheless, which is why many ignorant Westerners get very hilariously confused when they encounter Turkish movies or TV series and seeing that every single Turkish actor is quote-unquote white. Many with very pale skin, green or blue eyes, and light colored hair instead of the Arab brown representation in their minds. I think I've made my point.
Do you think Locke would have wanted Britain flooded with Africans and Pakistani rape gangs? Do you think this is what, he would have been like, yeah, thumbs up to that. We need more Pakistanis.
Don't import rape gangs or any individual who doesn't provide evidence that they can contribute to your society. Problem solved. Locke also wouldn't want Britain to be flooded with Italian mafia or Eastern European thieves either. Do I have to further explain to you that you shouldn't use race as a proxy?
Premise, it would be the same ideology of historical America, though. So, I mean, we have or historical Europe. I mean, why were the Muslims kept out? Why were the Muslims kept? Why did they fight a war with them?
Andrew, you do realize that European countries have historically fought many wars with many different countries, right? You do know that in terms of Great Britain, they had a long freaking war with the Spaniards and the French. Eventually, the Spaniards became a bigger threat due to the fact that Spain was not only the most powerful kingdom during the time, but they were Catholic and basically militant defenders of the faith. Something I still have difficult time understanding why. And I'm talking about approximately the 1400s to the 1600s, with their superior technology, especially their armada. In fact, if it weren't for luck that their ships were blown to bits because of weather, they probably would have conquered England and overthrown Elizabeth I. England was becoming more and more Protestant at the time. France was kind of at half and half in terms of power. And Spain, for centuries, wanted to make every fucking body Catholic, not just the fucking Muslims. They started the fucking Inquisition, for Christ's sakes, no pun intended. Do you have any idea how many people they tortured and burned on the stakes for ideological reasons? Something that ironically the Islamic Ottomans during the same period did not do. Not that the Ottomans were awesome freethinkers by our modern standards, and they did have other things that were arguably worse than the Spaniards, but they didn't have heresy laws and inquisitions like the Spaniards did, at least as far as I know. They did have this religious tax that you have to pay if you weren't a Muslim, and if you weren't a Muslim, you were not allowed to hold certain positions of governance. But still, I think I can argue that being better than torturing and burning people.
I agree with you.
So why are they not being kept out because of values and because you don't want to be...
Dangerous militant Muslims should be. Next.
Let's get back on track here. Let's talk about white people having a right to their own country or not. Why does every other people on the planet have a right to their own country and white people do not?
Well, it's kind of interesting why you keep using the term white, because, every other country doesn't use a racial identification in their claims in terms of the right to a country. Why is that? Is it possibly because you understand that the American ethnic group is not comprised of solely people of European descent? In China, we would never say that yellow people have the right to their own country. That's fucking stupid. Middle Eastern and Indian countries don't say brown people have a right to their own country. These are ethnic groups, not racial groups. I know you have a hard time telling the difference, and I get it. They racially coincide because, as I have mentioned, people who evolve in similar proximity tend to look similar. No fucking duh. The point is, they don't use race as a proxy. They use ethnicity, and the usage of ethnicity is also very specific. The people of America do not hold on to the same standards as an ethnic group as everywhere else. I haven't found a statistic, but it wouldn't surprise me if most people in America were recent immigrants after World War II. Americans as a group do not share common history, common language, common culture as other national ethnic states. They were not evolved on the American soil going back thousands of years. The only thing they now share is a set of agreed upon social principles and laws. Once again, if you want to stop immigration, that's fine. But stop it for everybody, including white immigrants. If you want to revise your immigration policies to make immigration more difficult and more meritocratic, that's fine. Do it for everybody. But if you want to just have white people immigrate to America but nobody else, I would be against that. Why? Because those white immigrants do not have the right to immigrate to America any more than anybody else. They do not have the criteria as an ethnic group in other ethnic national states have in terms of the right to the American land. Your European ancestors ethnically cleansed the natives and made America into an immigration country. So the situation is different now. Nobody else on earth historically did that. Not even the Ottomans with their conquest of 3 continents. That's the difference.
Immigration Act was because of Thomas Jefferson's ideology. That they just decided to open the borders to a bunch of people who were not in the country, did not belong in the country, because of the classical liberalism.
People who did not belong to the country included white people from Europe as well, you know. Those people have no right to American land. On the other hand, black people who were descendants of American slaves 200 years ago did have a right to American land. Again, this is using the criteria of who should have a right to their own land as everywhere else, which you, Andrew, likes to bring up again and again.
I don't know who made it, what
Well, this was the immigration before 1965 was white men of good character, and it was changed by primarily Jewish lawmakers and lobbyists to allow in all of these non-white people into our country.
Well, it sounds like these Jews did the right thing. I suspect that they did it so that so many Jews can immigrate to the States, and they're kind of like, oh shit, we have absolutely no right to this land more than anybody else. And say what you will about the Jews, initially after World War II, when they immigrated, America did benefit from it a lot, because the Jews played a pivotal role in raising American academic standards to be the best in the world, even beating out Great Britain.
What we need to do is establish the reality that we have a moral right to self-determination, and that these other people who have invaded our countries do not have a right to live in our countries and feed off of us.
If you mean we as tax-paying American citizens, and if you mean they, meaning economic opportunist migrants who feed off of American welfare system, I agree. But again, that goes for everybody. If white people from poor European countries are allowed to come in and do the same thing, I would be against that also. I'm going to be charitable and assume that you're not a hypocrite, and you agree with that as well.
I said that force will be necessary. State force will be necessary to, at some point. But once we've made the decision that we have a right, once white people have said we have a right to our own countries, we are going to act on that, then the amount of violence that happens is up to the people that are here. I mean, it's up to them to decide what happens. Because we're going to say, can you please leave?
For recent incoming immigrants, that's doable. For citizens who have been here for several generations, that would be a huge violation of human rights. Doesn't matter how you would do it, because these people, at least vast majority of them, have largely assimilated and got used to living in a place they consider to be their home. I'm a 1.5 generation immigrant, and I would not want to go back to the country of my origin. And it's not because in America I can leech off of great welfare system, because America doesn't really have a good one, or I can be more rich. In major cities of China, they are having huge economic booms that they are willing to pay, sometimes up to hundreds of thousands of dollars to hire you. That's why my parents wanted to make finding a job in China to be an option for me, and I don't like the prospect, not one single bit, because I am no longer adapted to that environment. The first time I went back to China to visit, I have realized this. I no longer have much things in common with the people and the culture there. I'm not adapted, for example, to the crowded, homogeneous environment, nor do I like it. I like and prefer diversity. One of the most important things I greatly cherish about America is that I can meet so many people from such diverse backgrounds, and I like to learn about all these different cultures and people. And that's precisely one of the reasons for why I'm motivated to be a voice for white people who are currently being demonized by leftist ideologues. If, on the other hand, I have enough affinity towards my birth country that I can go back and get used to the place, why then would I give a shit about white people? I would not fit in China as a Europhile. This is the reason why the repatriation movement of blacks weren't anywhere near successful in the 20s. The blacks could have left the country with all the discriminatory laws against them during that time, with all the lynchings that were going on. And the white population would be more than happy if they did that then. But they didn't, because they have nowhere else to go, really. They have no families in Africa they could go back to. They don't speak the language there. They would not be used to the environment or the culture. They probably won't be welcome there either. They would be considered foreigners in anywhere else. Nobody in such situation would like to be pressured to leave their home. Doesn't matter what incentives you give people. And that's why it would be a violation of individual rights.
And also this point about violence. violence. Okay, there's violence now, Sargon. If we're going to add up the amount of suffering, okay, if we were to do like a mathematical equation, if we're going to do a mathematical equation here of the amount of suffering, there is more suffering with these people in our countries, and that goes on for eternity. I mean, that goes on forever.
Yeah, it went all the way back to all the violence between different groups of white people as well. It will go on forever. America is not an isolated, homogeneous population state. Any state that has these characteristics will have intergroup violence that will go on forever. That's just a sad fact of human nature.
Yeah. This is why I said this is a failure of the British state. We're allowing this to happen. We would have far less rape gangs.
But you don't want to do anything about it.
Are you kidding? I absolutely want the state to do something about rape gangs.
So would you admit that there would be no more rape gangs if there were no more Muslims?
Sure, there will also be no more rape gangs if there were no more rape gangs, period. You can use a better proxy rather than sacrificing innocent individuals for no reason at all. And if you can't, why not do it?
And laugh. What you're saying is I am creating a moral justification for Muslim rape gangs. Because they would go away if you had the spine to say, we have a right to exist. We have a right to exist in our own country.
Yes, you as an individual also have a right to not exist if you choose not to. Why do I bring this up? Because I know many alt-right people are not happy with just stopping immigration altogether. They want to get rid of non-white citizens and permanent residents as well, and they want to continue immigration of white people. Why? Because they know that one of the big reasons why white people are dwindling is because they are relatively lower birth rates than other groups. How many children or having children at all would be individual decision to make and their right to have. Now, somebody like Millennial Wool might say, yes, but that's like a sinking ship and it's a moral duty to save white people. My answer to that would be, you are free to try to convince them if you believe that. But ultimately, it's their individual choice, and it's not your right to violate individual human rights to accommodate your ideology. It is quite possible that white people as a whole just don't want as many children as other people because, let's say, they want more freedom and less responsibility. They don't mind being dependent on other people. I see this every day in my institute where I work. There are jobs that only immigrants are willing to do, even though those jobs are open to American natives. But every single American native quit at the first opportunity, to the extent that the boss was forced to say that he preferred working with foreigners and immigrants, as they are much more reliable and they do a much better job. So there you go. Now some of you may argue that we can implement a libertarian free market to correct the problem, that in a white state, jobs that white people don't do or not willing to do will simply not exist. But you should know how much of a risk this is, because there could be and probably are many jobs that white people don't want to do as much, but they benefit from their existence quite a lot. Sort of like so many jobs women as a group don't want to do. Doesn't matter if they're very high paid jobs and they leave men to do them. But they wouldn't want those jobs to go away because they greatly benefit from them. So you would effectively get rid of probably millions of potential jobs. So even implementing a libertarian free market system and even assuming that it will eventually work out would take probably many generations. And people within those generations would suffer a lot. I'm not so sure that's a cost people in your utopian state will want to take.
No, you would just require ID and enforce it for people to work in areas that had high numbers of illegal immigrants. Okay, so if you did that, if you outlawed working, you outlawed welfare, and you outlawed renting property, the overwhelming majority, more than 95% of Mexicans would leave.
Mexican recent immigrants, probably, not Hispanic natives, and I highly doubt Hispanic citizens. You see, you're still conflating these two things. Citizens and immigrants are two complete different groups. That's why you can't use race as a proxy to make these decisions.
Right, okay, maybe we shouldn't do that.
Maybe we shouldn't have black people, okay? Because what do you think? Let me ask you a direct question. What do black people provide to society? Because I guess we've granted all this after your thing with what's his name, Kraut. We're not discussing race realism anymore, right? So do you think black people provide anything at all to Western society?
I don't think black people's contribution of the American culture arts can be trivialized. If you think so, I don't think you know American history as well as you think. Sure, black people as a group have not contributed in the sciences as much as white people or Asians, but their tradition for centuries in America have been in the arts, particularly in music. They've pretty much invented several types of music such as the blues, soul, various forms of hip hop. In fact, their musical contribution is so significant that even during the scientific racism, the people during the 30s who thought black people were the lowest of all the racial groups had exceptions of their superior sense of rhythm. Part of the American culture is black culture, whether you like it or not. They've also contributed in literature, in acting. I personally find black people in general in America to be superior actors than, let's say, Asians. This tend to be my opinion just from my own observation, and I tend to believe on average they are just as good as whites if you take population statistic into account. Obviously being 13% of the population, you wouldn't have nearly as many roles for blacks as you would for whites. Not saying that there should be more, by the way. Now you might say, okay, but their destruction outweigh their contributions. Well, to be honest, I would need to see a longitudinal black crime rate going back longer, because I do know that their crime rate has increased as decades went on. So the high crime rate might be more of a recent phenomenon than what most people think. And I tend to believe this as primarily a result of the leftist ideologues pampering them and white guilting everybody else. I don't know if black people by nature are more violent. I'm saying that this is largely an unknown, and either way, there are many ways that many people have brought up to greatly alleviate or solve the problem, if not getting rid of the problem altogether, without violating their human and citizenship rights.
Hasn't got a right to exist.
Well, what he said is that human existence has a deeper meaning than this mathematical equation that you presented as the meaning of existence, that we should base our morality off of a mathematical equation as to who is going to suffer. And I think that's an underlying philosophical difference.
I haven't read this guy, but this is quite vague. But I'm just going to guess that it's one of those human beings form family and groups, race is your larger family that you belong to that you should defend, yada yada. Sorry, whether that's true or not, we should strive towards individualism and fairness for all, whether it's achievable or not. Just as we should probably never become completely peaceful, there are probably always going to be wars, but we should strive to not make wars with each other's country as much as possible. Because we know these principles will maximize individual happiness. That's what's important. Okay, I think I'm going to stop right here. I haven't listened to the whole stream, but I think this is enough as a response. This Andrew guy really isn't worth having a serious discussion with, from the impression I got so far for an hour. But like I said, Sargon for some reason just can't debate these people. He can do the equivalent quality people like Thomas Smith quite fine, but these people, maybe it just gets his emotions up too high or something, but it's like his brain just gets turned off. I don't agree with V that you can't debate with them, and hopefully I have demonstrated that you can. I would like to point out one more thing, which is regarding whether I support a white ethno-state, or an ethno-state that's majority white. I've listened to JF's answer on this recently. He was responding to some simple-minded Indian girl. I didn't watch it all the way through, but I got to the important bit, which is what his opinion on the formation of an ethno-state can go. And JF is, of course, is one of the smarter ones, so he was careful to avoid using the term white ethno-state and just went with an ethno-state instead, which is much more clever. I didn't find myself disagreeing with anything he said about it, so what he said would essentially be my opinion on the matter. The only thing I would add would be I would have a problem if when the ethno-state is formed, the people, let's just say white people for simplicity's sakes, the white people who decide to form it would take and utilize resources that they're not entitled to relative to other groups. This is what I've been talking about. America has been heavily dependent upon non-European groups for centuries now. So much of the inventions, the creations, the resources are developed by non-whites. You also have a huge non-white workforce that makes it possible for such low prices on goods you buy on the market. Your iPhone, for example, are made overseas, in China or India. So if these white people are willing to only take the resources that white people provide into their ethno-state, I would have no problem. But if they take, let's say, companies that were built largely on the shoulders of non-white immigrants, and yet excluding those people if those people wanted to come along with them into their ethno state, then they have no right to reject these people whatsoever. You can't just take resources other people provided for you and then exclude them. And that would be why I think unless dire situation happens, let's say like racial war or something, a white ethno state, at least in America, will not work while keeping to fair human rights, or it would likely be an exceedingly poor state, like Belarus. Sure, most people are white, but it's not developing very much. Those are my food for thought.